Welcome to part 2 of my series on Canada. Let's have a conversation about the last half century of Canada and what we can learn as we look to its future. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. Today is a second part in my series on Canada. Last week, I delved into one of Canada's most loved music bands, the Tragically Hip. Today, we'll explore what it means to be Canadian in 2026 and look back at the last 50 years of Canada through the eyes of two of my best friends. Next week will be a special episode for Canada Day. For those not Canadian, let me give you a short history of Canada. Canada, that vast landmass above the United States, it's the second largest country in the world. It has been peopled by the First Nations and their ancient ancestors for tens of thousands of years, where they have hunted as glaciers retreated and the land rose. In more recent times, Europeans came from across the sea, first the Vikings, followed by early European settlers, the British, French, Portuguese, and more. At first, a dominion of the British Crown, the colonies above the United States, primarily Upper and Lower Canada, formed to create a confederation, and in 1867, we became the entity that we nowadays call Canada. As with all origin stories, this origin story leaves out a lot. Canadians like to think our origin story was boring, peaceful, uninteresting. Compared to many origin stories, that might be true, but Canadian history is a history of the provinces. It is, for example, the history of a country, in this case, Newfoundland and Labrador, giving up its nationhood and becoming a province. It's the history of First Nations and treaties, languages and world wars. The history of Canada, in short, like all history of humanity, is one written by winners, challenged by those who are marginalized, and corrected by those who care. To the outside, we are a polite people, a caricature of the frozen north, a nation of hockey lovers, beavers, and maple syrup. The thing about a country is that it is an imaginary border that is agreed by consensus. There's really no reason why we have such groupings of people, and any alien landing on this planet would be astounded to know that we cannot just freely wander from place to place. And yet, our brains require community. We want to belong. But community and consensus requires conversation. On a beautifully sunny day in Berlin, Germany, I met up with my two fellow Canadians who, like me, were observing our country from afar. In a small tea garden with clinking glassware, Sylvia Warkentin, her husband Erwin Warkentin, and I recorded a conversation about the Canada they had witnessed for the last half century and more. I asked Sylvia and Erwin 3 questions, and I let them talk. First, think back to how Canada has changed in the last 50 years. Second, how has it changed for the First Nations of Canada? And lastly, some words of wisdom to everybody. Here is that conversation.
Hi, my name is Sylvia.
Hi, my name's Erwin Warkentin, and I've been here before.
Having been born in Saskatchewan, raised in Edmonton, lived in Ontario and in Newfoundland, Manitoba, lived all over Canada. And growing up and on the prairies, I found that there wasn't as much diversity as there is now. When I go back to cities like Edmonton now, I'm surprised at the difference, the cultural differences, the different languages spoken, the skin color, lack of a better way of putting it. I like that. It was that diversity. I want to see more of it in the years to come. And the tolerance, not that there's intolerance, the fact that Canada welcomes these kinds of people from all kinds of, like my parents were immigrants too, but we're European immigrants. And now there's immigrants coming in from different countries, Asian countries, African countries. That wasn't happening 50 years ago. There's a lot more of that now. And I like that. the difference between melting pot idea and a mosaic. I like the mosaic. I was raised German in Canada, and I was able to keep both of those. I wasn't so much assimilated as be able to keep them all. And I like that mosaic of having friends who have different languages spoken at home and eat different things and have different cultural practices. And doesn't it all become one, like a melting pot? And being able to have the multiple identities, that makes life exciting, makes it interesting. I always see myself as a hyphenated Canadian. I think because Canada on the world scene is a baby country. We're barely 100 years old, 150 years old. Being a Canadian is Canadian something, German Canadian, Italian Canadian, whatever. It's just nice to be able to maintain one's own heritage and Canadian as well. And that Canada allows for that. Mm-hmm. People have respect for Canadians. So having traveled, especially now where people are envious of the fact that we are Canadians and we're not those people down south. Because we're such a big country and we're needing the people here to have more immigrants. I know there's people in Canada who would say, nah, stop that. But we're not having our own children. We need immigrants. We need to grow Canada. And if that means inviting more people from more different countries, so be it. Go for it. Let's do it.
My experience is perhaps it's very similar, but perhaps a little bit different. When you say 50 years ago, I was 17 and one day old 50 years ago. So I have a little bit of experience. I have experience previous to that. But my family was a little different in that my great-grandmother was born in Canada already, on my mother's side. On my father's side, not so much. But they did share a heritage in their Mennonite background. And so oddly enough, I didn't grow up speaking English or German, but I grew up speaking Low German, our own Plautdeutsch, which immediately set us apart from everyone else in the community that we lived. I grew up in Winnipeg, and in the immigrant part of Winnipeg, right downtown. So we had people from all over the world all around us. So I have this other sort of background, and also my name. If you're in Manitoba or in Winnipeg, my name immediately categorizes me as someone from southern Manitoba, specifically from either Winkler or Altona or someplace like that. And so the world I grew up in, was a world that categorized people very easily. Yes, it didn't have a lot of the different flavors that we had today, but somehow we find diversity anyway. That is, we sometimes pit one another off against one another, us and them. And so I was one of them. In all of that, I found that the Mennonite community and the Jewish community actually kind of grew together. They were also easily identified by their names and such. In Manitoba, there was a running joke at one point that if your lawyer isn't either Jewish or Mennonite, somebody's been messing with their religion. So this is kind of the background that I came from. I still remember when my father got his Canadian citizenship, standing there in front of the judge, and they did it at that time. They still did it individually. They did have a group thing, but then they all had to go up and individually swear allegiance. I don't know if that's still done today. I remember the first time he voted, and for him that was a huge, huge deal, being able to vote in Canada. I remember when Canada turned 100 in 67, we had Bobby Jimby coming around and making us all feel good about ourselves, singing the Canada song. So these are these early memories that I have of a Canada that was, I think, very naive in many respects. It felt good about itself, but it hadn't really considered itself a mosaic yet. We've kind of grown into that over time as the minorities, shall we say, have become more visible. What else is it about Canada that's changed over time? I think we have always been a little bit insecure, but I think it's been a bit of a false insecurity in that basically deep down, we are secure in who we are as Canadians. There's this kind of running joke about Canadians may not know exactly who they are, but they're sure they're not Americans. And this is where the other part of my growing up comes into play. I spent a lot of my summers out on the farm, and the border, the Canada-US border, ran past the end of the schoolyard. And so if you hit a home run playing baseball in this place called Blumenort, Manitoba, you actually had to go and get the ball back from the United States. And so we grew up with Americans literally on our doorsteps. And so we did have a lot of interaction with them. We even had a baseball team that on alternate years, it would change from 4 and 5. So 4 Americans, 5 Canadians on the field at any time. And then the next year they would flip it around so that there would be 5 Americans, 4 Canadians. And it worked really well. And it was one of these things where we were supposed to forget about this border. But that mentality has really changed over time. I would say since 9/11, that border has become a hard and fast thing that you don't necessarily want to cross. As kids, we just walked over to the other side and went swimming there. But now as Canadians, we want to stay on our side of the border. And so we start casting a little bit of suspicion over onto the other side. But that's a fairly recent thing and isn't really kind of part of the Canadian experience and how we developed over time. I think it's just that we've kind of gone along and developed this, sense of who we are, and we wear it proudly, but we don't kind of stick it in anyone's face. We're open to other cultures, other people from other parts of the world, and are interested in who they are, what their culture is like, and what it might have to offer to the richness of Canadian culture. So in other words, we don't have this one culture that kind of remains fossilized and everybody has to kind of conform to that, but rather it's a way of looking at the world where we say, okay, yeah, we've got this, but there's room for more. Or, that kind of food is interesting. I like the way that tastes. So I'm going to incorporate that into the Canadian experience. Or that music, for example, the music from India, for some reason, some of it is, I just find it fascinating, the older traditional sort of stuff. So why shouldn't we have that? In Winnipeg, we had this, I know a lot of places have these cultural celebrations. There we had Folklorama, and we would go to the various pavilions. I know Edmonton had something similar. They would always have that one park. We actually had a drive all over the city, and you'd get a bus pass, and kids could get a bus pass and go to all of the different pavilions. And of course, we would try to avoid the German pavilion because we knew what was there. The Lebanese pavilion was always the most interesting because they had dancers. But we also received an education there as to what that dance really meant and how it fit into their culture and how it might actually fit into our Canadian culture. And so that was always this emphasis. Yes, it's separate, but it now becomes part of who we all are, and we can enjoy it if we want. But the Canada of today, I fret for it simply because of the political situation that we have. I think in all of this, the one positive thing that I see coming from it is Canada and Canadians are developing a backbone in that they will definitely say, these are things that we stand for. And we don't care if, in this case, the United States says we should change our mind and go along with them. Say, no, those are not values that we hold true to. And that's what I see as the Canada of 2026 becoming. Yes, there's all kinds of financial issues and this and that and the other thing. But I think the one positive we can take from it is that we're pulling together and we're reaffirming the values that we hold dear. And those are these values of diversity, of various cultures being able to work together peacefully and creating not a single culture necessarily, but a single culture in its multiplicity.
even something simple like going to the grocery stores. When I was little, there was no foreign food aisles. Now the foreign food aisle takes up like half the grocery store. And I like going down there like, oh, that's cool. I want to try that. And I want more of that in Canada.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the foreign food aisle is the foreign food aisle used to be your own grocery stores and your own butcher shops and your own bakeries, which you only knew about, and others from other cultures just kind of accidentally discovered. And now it's a little more overt. If it is in the larger grocery stores, it's there for everyone to share in.
The First Nation last 50 years, I think if anything, it's become almost worse for them. I think nothing hasn't changed. Nothing much has changed for them. If anything, it's become worse because you still hear women going missing or finding bodies, and the employment difficulties that they're having, places to live, and the homelessness is become more obvious, but especially in the bigger centers like Edmonton and Winnipeg. The First Nations still struggle a whole lot, which is unfortunate and probably not an easy answer, like I say, because that goes back generations. It goes back to when Canada was colonized, and words like genocide have been used. And yeah, it's, and how do you get over that? What do you do with it? It's a very complex problem.
I grew up, as I said, in a place where there were immigrants, but we also had a lot of First Nations kids that I grew up with. They were just other kids in the neighborhood. We didn't necessarily think of them as anything different. They were just kids. I also want to mention the Métis. We had a lot of Métis kids in our neighborhood and in our schools. I sometimes worry about where some of them have ended up simply because of the disadvantages that they suffered.
And still do.
And still do. Because of their heritage, because of their background, and the way we have systematically discriminated against them. We're in Berlin, Germany. In Germany, we know a thing or two about genocides and crimes against other peoples. One of the things that they do here, if you walk down the streets, you'll see these little bronze, we call them Stolpersteine, that you're supposed to trip. They're tripping stones. And they have people's names on them, when they were taken, when they died, where they died, during the Holocaust. I would like Canadians to consider for a moment putting up little memorials like that to all of the women and all Aboriginal people who have lost their lives through violent means, and put a sign there that we have to trip across so that we remind ourselves of what's happened. We need to do something to remember the children that died in these schools so that they're not forgotten, so that they're remembered, and so that we as Canadians also know that we have participated in what some people call a genocide. I would tend towards agreeing with that assessment, but shall we say it was a crime that we committed against them and continue in many respects to commit against them. Yes, there's things that have changed. For example, in Manitoba, you have a First Nations person who's the premier. I would say stick with it. I think Canada, in many respects, is going in a very positive, in a good direction. Yeah, there's some dark things that may be coming forward, but you live through it and you make yourself better, and you promise not to do it again.
From what I'm hearing from this side of the pond is that Canada is getting united behind a certain cause. We're strengthening, getting more self-confident. And that's what it seems to me from here. And yeah, keep doing that. Resist the urge to be subscribed or subsumed, that's the word I'm looking for, subsumed by outside forces, namely those from the South. But it's good to see Canada standing up for itself and growing stronger, uniting behind the fact that they are Canadian, which is something different from an American or a European. We're Canadian, period.
Thank you to Sylvia and Erwin Warkentin for joining me on the show and having a conversation about Canada. Next week, I will have a very special episode for Canada Day, and I hope you will join me for that. What did you think about our discussion? I would love to hear from you. Please get in touch with me at contact@dups.ca. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dups.ca. That's TALES.dups.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human imagination. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by me, your host, Dilipa Vijayawardena. If you are lucky enough to have a pet, give them some treats and a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.